All right, so you guys made it through verse 15 last week, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, as a lead into that, I'm going to go ahead and reread verses 14 and 15, and I'm going to read through verse 21, and then we can go from there. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? How can they believe in the one whom they have not heard? How can they hear without someone preaching to them? How can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. But not all the Israelites accepted the good news, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. But I ask, did they not hear? Of course they did. Their voice has gone out into all the earth, their words to the end of the world. Again I ask, did Israel not understand? First, Moses says, I will make you envious by those who are not a nation. I will make you angry by a nation that has no understanding. And Isaiah boldly says, I was found by those who did not seek me. I revealed myself to those who did not ask for me. But concerning Israel, he says, all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people. All right, as we look at these, the first thing we can see is, and I'm sure that Todd touched on it last time, there's these four questions that Paul asks, and it's referring us, of course, back to the previous verse 18, where he says, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And so then he asks these questions, well, how will they call on him who they had not believed? And of course, that question presupposes a knowledge of God. And then how will they believe in him who they've not heard? People need to hear about God before they can believe in him. How will they hear without a preacher? Now, we have to understand, too, that preacher word there, it's translated preacher, but it would have probably could easily also be herald, somebody who goes proclaiming news about something, kind of like a herald would come into a city and blow a trumpet and make an announcement. And so he's saying, there has to be a herald, and of course, a herald is useless unless there's people to hear it. And then the last question, how will they preach if they're not sent? And that word sent, of course, is from the same word as apostle. And so it's the herald or the preacher, the person who proclaims, they pass on this message that God has for his people. And, we see here these 6 ideas, and the author, I think his name was John Stott, he said the essence of Paul's argument is seen if we put his 6 verbs in the opposite order. Christ sends heralds, heralds preach, people hear, hearers believe, believers call, and those who call are saved. And so when we look at that line of logic that Paul is laying out, he's sharing this foundation for the Christian evangelism and mission. The first thing is that Christ sends people to proclaim who have already experienced him, and then it goes to that process leading people who hear that message to believe, and then they call out to God and they are saved as well, and then God turns them also into proclaimers, into heralds too. And we know that if we ask the question, well, who's to be evangelized, it's both Jews and Gentiles. Then we see, of course, here in the context of Romans chapters 9 through 11, Paul aimed these verses mostly at the Jews. And that conclusion is reinforced through a series of things he is going to utilize here in the rest of chapter 10. The first of those is this kind of loose paraphrase of Isaiah 52, verse 7, talking about the beauty of the feet of those who proclaim the good news of good things. And I am going to actually read from Isaiah 52 a little bit more in the context of that, because when we see what this is coming from, it adds to the context and the meaning we're looking at. Because when we start here in Isaiah 52 verse 1, it says, "Awake, awake, Zion, clothe yourself with strength, put on your garments of splendor, Jerusalem, the holy city. The uncircumcised and defiled will not enter you again. Shake off your dust, rise up, sit enthroned, Jerusalem. Free yourself from the chains on your neck, daughter Zion, now a captive. For this is what the Lord says, you were sold for nothing, without money you were redeemed. This is what the sovereign Lord says, at first my people went down to Egypt to live. Lately Assyria has oppressed them. Now what do I have here, declares the Lord? For my people have been taken away for nothing. Those who rule them mock, declares the Lord. And all day long my name is constantly blasphemed. Therefore my people will know my name. Therefore in that day they will know that it is I who foretold it. Yes, it is I. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news, who proclaim peace, who bring good tidings, who proclaim salvation, who say to Zion, your God reigns." And so the context of Isaiah 52, of course, is Israel being in bondage, enslaved yet again. We know they had been many times in their history. And so here they are enslaved again. And so that's kind of the context that he's sharing this from. And so when he uses this in Romans 10, that the setting in Isaiah gave comfort to those that were enslaved, that they would be let free. They were going to be freed from their captivity. And so Paul is applying this, of course, to the gospel message, freedom from the captivity of sin. And so he uses this idea that people should rejoice. If they rejoice that they're released from the exile before, they should do much more about the gospel message. And of course, when we think about beautiful feet, that was the way the messages were carried back then. The heralds usually would walk. Messengers would run or walk from town to town. And so, talking about beautiful feet is just saying, hey, we hear the sandals coming of the person who's coming to bring us good news. And so when we get into Romans 10, verse 16, it is citing Isaiah 53, verse 1. And Paul here is pointing out the fact that even though good news arrives, not everyone believes it. And we see that in the ministry of Jesus, in the ministry of Paul, in the ministry of the apostles. How many, what percentage, I don't know if we can figure that out. In general terms, how many of the people of Israel accepted the message of Jesus as the Messiah when he came?
Probably less than 1%.
Yeah, hardly any. Very, very few. And so this is kind of what Paul is kind of sharing here, that even though good news comes, that doesn't mean everybody accepts it. The ministry of Paul, he went and he preached everywhere, but a large percentage rejected it. Most of the people, and this is kind of discouraging maybe for us today, but the reality is most of the people that we might witness to are probably not going to accept the message that we share with them. But we have to remember, rejection doesn't mean we should stop telling the gospel story. Because Paul clearly says in Romans 10, verse 17, faith comes from hearing, and hearing from the word of Christ. And so if we give out the message that Christ has given to us, if we proclaim it, the end result is in God's hands. We've done what we have been called to do, and I would say probably compelled to do. So then Paul asks in verse 18, Did the Jews really hear? Did they have a fair chance to listen to the gospel message? Perhaps the reason that not many of them accepted it is that maybe they never really heard it in the first place. Paul says absolutely not. And he quotes a verse from Psalm 19, Psalm 19, verse 4, to prove his point. Their voice goes into all the earth, their words to the end of the world. And so then he selects this psalm because it speaks of, when you look at it in context and you go and read it, it speaks of worldwide witness to God. And so what Paul does here is he transfers a forceful language about global witness from God's physical creation to the church, kind of portraying the former one as symbolic of the latter. So it's saying that God's truth is proclaimed to the whole world as a witness, and then here Paul is saying, and the church is kind of like a microcosm of that message that God has put into the whole world. It's basically the message of himself put into flesh and blood. And so the Jews would have no excuse because the message came to them. Let me just throw a little aside here. This idea of the herald or somebody coming with good news and wanting to share something good. I'll give you an assignment to do maybe during next week if you think about it. If there is someone specific in your life that is still alive who has had a really profound impact in portraying to you who God is, in showing you either by word or deed this gospel message, I would encourage you during the next week, send them a text message, maybe phone, call on the phone, or send them a card or something. Find a way to let somebody know. I don't necessarily encourage you to tell them, by the way, you have beautiful feet. That may not go over well. But use that principle. Somebody who may have just brought a good message into your life, just let them know that they were a blessing to you. Because that's always an encouragement. So that's just a little aside I wanted to kind of throw in there. When we think about the gospel message, we have to realize, that the plain fact of it has spread to the far corners of the Jewish world. It had at the time of Paul even. Jewish pilgrims from all over the area that was Judaism. They filled Jerusalem at the Passover when the crucifixion happened, and also the day of Pentecost. Probably a fair percentage had heard of the big news. Now they may have heard it as gossip or whatever, but many of them probably took reports home with them, and maybe some people couldn't make it to Jerusalem, and so when they got back, it's like, man, what happened? And so they gave them a report. Oh, and then there was this stuff that happened. I'm not even sure all what it meant, but this stuff was going on, and this is the stuff we heard. And so at least the seed of the gospel had gone into what at that time would have been considered the ends of the earth, into the inhabited world. So then we can imagine, Paul's readers kind of saying to themselves, all right, so we might agree that the Jews had at least heard the gospel, but maybe they didn't understand it. I mean, wouldn't that explain the reason for their unbelief? Well, Paul kind of assumes that's going to be a question on their minds, and he rejects the claims of those. And so in the process, he not only asserts the Jews understood, but here in chapter 10, verses 19 and 20, he presents a couple of references to prove the point. The first one comes from Deuteronomy 32, verse 21. Deuteronomy 32:21. I'll read it again. It's verse 19. Again, I ask, did Israel not understand? First, Moses says, I will make you envious by those who are not a nation. I will make you angry by a nation that has no understanding. In this, God is kind of saying that he will transfer his favor to another people because of Israel's rebellion and disobedience. And that will force the Jewish nation to become jealous of a people that was not a nation. And it lacked understanding, possessed by Israel. So that's kind of what God is saying there in Deuteronomy, and Paul is applying it here. And the reality is, Israel was a nation of people, but those who were accepting the gospel were from all nations, all tribes, tongues, all peoples at that time. It wasn't a defined nation like they were at that time. And so there were some that were like, wait a second, this isn't fair. Why? We have our nation that we've had for all these generations, and here they get special understanding. And so the idea, of course, here in the Deuteronomy passage is that when Israel saw what was happening among the Gentiles, it would provoke them into securing some of the blessing for themselves. And of course, Paul is implying that if that's true in the political realm, that it's also the case in the spiritual world as well. The Jewish people did not lack knowledge. We kind of might describe the Gentiles as a nation without understanding. But the Jews had the law, the covenant. They had this history and a knowledge of God's ways. They had amazing blessings that had been given to them. And so given their spiritual advantages, they should have been angry that they were losing the blessing. And so Paul, of course, there was applying this lesson from their history to the Jews in Rome who needed to be awakened and maybe aroused with a little bit of jealousy about their need as they witnessed large numbers of Gentiles flowing into the Christian community in Rome and experiencing amazing things. It was not uncommon in that time to have these this ability that God gave to speak in tongues, and there were healings that took place, and all these miracles. And the fact that that those who became Christians, that they could see the generosity in them and the kindness that they portrayed, and so in some ways, Paul was kind of trying to hint here. Y'all aren't you paying attention to this? Shouldn't this arouse in you something? Don't you want some of this? Well, then, having presented Moses as a witness against the excuse that many Jews hadn't accepted the gospel because they hadn't understood it, then Paul brings in Isaiah into Romans 10, verse 20, who's even more forceful in making his point. And so I'm going to read that really quick again, what he says there from Isaiah 65:1. And Isaiah boldly says, I was found by those who did not seek me. I revealed myself to those who did not ask for me. If Moses had cut off any legitimate excuse of ignorance on the part of the Jews and set the stage for the inclusion of the Gentiles, Isaiah, in his statement, is even stronger for incorporating them into the covenant promises. And so from the first part here of Isaiah 65:1, Paul quotes this, I revealed myself to those who did not ask. I was found by those who did not seek me. The context in Isaiah, it's contrasting God's actively seeking after the Gentiles to the failure of the Jews to respond to his grace, so much that they provoke him with their rebellion in religious things. You actually see that as it goes on in Isaiah 65, the second half of verse 1 and through verse 3. God's like, look, these people didn't seek after me, and yet I'm giving them understanding. You know, and myself had asked for me, and they're responding, why aren't you? And so in Isaiah, it's almost like God's getting angry. You should want some of the understanding that they're getting. And so Paul is telling the Jews in here, they don't know their own history. If they think that they are the only people that God cares for because they're Abraham's children, they need to go back and read Isaiah 65. And I would say that, in Isaiah 65, there's lessons for people in every age of the world's history. We can learn a lot about our present situation by reviewing how God dealt with his people and his church in past history. Doesn't Ellen White say, we have nothing to fear for the future except as we shall forget God's leading in our past history? We do need to make it a point to look back at times about how God has guided and blessed and things like that in order to learn those lessons and not to repeat them, grow from there. And then in verse 21 here, Paul concludes kind of this issue that he raised in verse 16 as to why not all the Jews had accepted the gospel. It wasn't because they hadn't heard, according to verse 18. It wasn't because they didn't understand, according to verses 19 and 20. Their real problem, that Paul says, is they are disobedient and contrary or obstinate. And so citing Isaiah 65 verse 2, Paul shows here God had repeatedly reached out his hands to the Israelites. He had played the part of the parent, inviting, again the author John Stott puts it, he was inviting a child to come home, offering a hug and a kiss and promising a welcome. God had taken the initiative in extending his hand to Israel. But he did so all day long, according to Romans 10:21. This is where Paul is applying this. And in verse 21, all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient, obstinate people. Question for all of us on here. How many of us, in trying to encourage a child to come to us, would have done it all day long, holding out our hands? Come on, come on. You're welcome here. Please come. Eventually, our arms get tired. We get frustrated. We give up. We're like, okay, I'm done. I'm finished. And yet this image here that Paul is bringing out of Isaiah 65 is picturing God. All day long, he's got his hands out to them. So as we take the passage that we've been studying from here from verses 14 through 21 in totality, in its context, Romans 1 through 8, chapter, again, find Paul setting forth his gospel as being for both Jew and Gentile. Not many Jews had accepted it. It led Paul into a major discussion as it failed. And on the other hand, how the Gentiles had found entrance into the covenant promises. In chapter 9, he set forth the answer to those issues in terms of God's mercy. He chose to offer mercy to all who would accept it. And then here we've gotten to chapter 10, where it's examining this issue in terms of Israel's response to the gospel. And so what Paul is saying, for the most part, it wasn't positive. It really wasn't positive. And then he brings in these verses from the Old Testament, from their history, to say, this is kind of a pattern that continues, it seems to be followed. And so then Paul, kind of concludes with his treatment of the Jewish rejection of the gospel. He'll conclude that part of it in the next chapter, in chapter 11, which we will start on next week. And we'll get into chapter 11 then. We'll probably do the first 10 verses or so. So that brings us through chapter 10. Any thoughts on this chapter?
Well, Pastor,
yeah,
you talked about, a lot of times we do things that we're not successful, but we keep on doing it. And if Jesus were seeking a job in the Florida conference today, and based on his track record, they say 3.5 years, not a lot of success.
That's a good point there.
I mean, but Jesus kept right on, regardless of who accepted or didn't accept.
Yeah,
he kept bringing the message and moving on, And so,
yeah,
we can't always gauge our successes by numbers, and I think sometimes we as humans or businesses look at numbers instead of human beings. So
yeah, I would totally agree. That is true. Sometimes our metrics get off into statistics.
Yep.
And that's not always a measure. Yeah. Good reminder. Yeah. If you look at the ministry of Jesus and you looked at it, in earthly terms, he wasn't successful. And yet, look at it now.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
All right.
Is the Bible the best-selling book in the world?
Yeah, I think it still is. Praise the Lord for that.
Yep. Amen.
Although I would say, unfortunately, sometimes it's the best-selling and the least read.
Less read.
A lot of people have it, but not enough people are actually reading it and studying it.
It's holding that coffee table down.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Any other thoughts? Great. Okay. This is I hope everybody still is enjoying Romans, because it is such a good book.